Called to the. Okay, right. So, did you see the video?
I saw it was there, but wasn't sure that I should watch it because I watched it the one before and thought as I knew all the answers, so I thought I'll hold off watching it because I didn't think I
Okay.
was supposed to.
So, shall we play the video then?
Okay.
Would that be helpful?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Right. So I'll maximize that. Oh, no, that won't do. Hang on, I'm just trying to work out how to share it. Okay. Right. Share sound. Okay. So, of course, if you want to
Hello and
pause,
welcome to the lecture on.
just say pause and then we'll pause, okay? Otherwise, we'll stop at strategic moments and have a chat. It's not very long, actually. It's only about 20 minutes long. So we've got plenty of time. So please do stop if you want to stop.
Okay.
Habakkuk chapters 1 and 2. In this lecture, I want to provide you with an overview of those chapters, look at some bits of the text that are interesting or important, and just generally introduce the interpretative issues that we have in this text. The text after the superscription, which basically only tells us that we have here an oracle by the prophet Habakkuk, begins with a passage consisting of 3 verses in which Habakkuk speaks and addresses the Lord. The language is very typical of the language that you find in the Psalms of lament. The phrase, "How long, O Lord, shall I cry for help?" is a very typical expression for laments. "Why do you make me see wrongdoing?" That kind of language you can often encounter in the Psalms. So the prophet is lamenting before the Lord, and the words highlighted in red here are the problem that he sees. There is violence, the law is not effective, and justice never prevails. So it is a social complaint. It is a complaint about the state of society, especially in relation to justice and oppression. The Hebrew expression "cry for help" is also quite often used in a judicial context. And the problem is that there are 2 groups, the wicked and the righteous. That division there is central to the issue. The righteous are those who are oppressed, who are denied justice, and the wicked are their powerful oppressors. As you will see, this is all very general. We are not told who the wicked and the righteous are, and one of the important tasks in interpreting this passage and the book as a whole is deciding whether these general categories may be referred to something more specific. And different historical approaches, as you will see when you read the set reading, will have different answers to that. Then in verse 5 we have the first major shift. Initially, we are not, if we read the passage for the first time, initially maybe we will not sense that there is a shift because "look at the nations and see, be astonished, be astounded." That sort of could be the continuation of the lament. But as soon as we reach verse 6, we understand that there has been actually a change of speaker. And now it's not the prophet who speaks, but the Lord, because the phrase "I am rousing the Chaldeans" could only refer to God doing the action. And so this is the work that is being done in your days, the rousing of the Chaldeans. And the Chaldeans are a nation ethnic group which conquered Babylon, established a dynasty there, and from there they overthrew the Assyrian Empire. And eventually, at the beginning of the 6th century, the Chaldeans were the people who destroyed the city of Jerusalem, burned down the temple, and took the people of Judah into exile. The Chaldean king Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon, is a very well-known figure in the Bible because of that. And so this mention of the Chaldeans helps us to anchor the text in one possible historical period, around about the time of either before or after the destruction of Jerusalem. And this is the only clue in the book that might possibly give us the historical context in which we're supposed to be reading it. And this passage describes, in a nutshell, the rise of the Chaldeans, the fierceness of their army, an overwhelming sense of threat and power and violence. In verse 12, we have another shift. So again, here the prophet begins to speak, and again you have the language of lament. He is complaining again, and he continues this theme of the opposition between righteous and wicked, and he laments the fact that God does nothing in the face of this problem, and he allows the wicked to continue to act without any consequence or judgment. In verse 12, it is interesting to note the preposition, the pronoun them. O Lord, you have marked them for judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for punishment. And the interesting, important question is, of course, who are they? Who are these people? Within the context, it might refer to the Babylonians, who are mentioned in the previous passage, or it may refer to the victims of the Babylonians, or it may refer to the wicked if they are a different group than the Babylonians. So at this stage, it is important, interesting to bear in mind that ambiguity. And again, different historical approaches will answer the question, who are they, in different ways. But to sum up, what we have in chapter 1 are three passages that are differentiated because of the speaker in each passage and because of their genre. So we have Habakkuk speaking, then God, and then Habakkuk again. And you have the alternations of lament, then a divine oracle, and then another lament. It is, of course, most important to understand how these different passages relate to each other and what do they do. And here are two different possible explanations or readings of the text, depending on how one perceives the connection between these passages. The most popular, by far, reading of Habakkuk has been as a dialogue, in which Habakkuk complains initially in verses 2 to 4, then God answers him in verses 5 to 11, and then Habakkuk complains again in verses 12 to 17. If we go with that reading, the wicked in the first lament are the Judean aristocracy, because, as you will remember, the problem there was lack of justice and the weakness of the law. The law is not applied consistently, and therefore the wicked trample on the righteous. And in this case, the lament is about the social and political conditions in the state of Judah, and Habakkuk is complaining against the Judean aristocracy because of the way that they rule and the impact they have on society. If we go with that, then in verses 5 to 11, God answers that complaint by saying, don't worry, I'm rousing the Chaldeans, I'm sending them. And the implication is that they will bring judgment on the rulers and princes of Judah who have acted wickedly. And that's God's solution to that. And then Habakkuk's complaint in this case would be that actually the Babylonians are even more violent and unjust than the Judean aristocracy, and therefore that action does not solve the problem, it compounds it and increases it. So that is one way of reading the book as a dialogue. If you go in this direction, there is a different way in which you don't see the first chapter as a dialogue, but as one lament. So Habakkuk complains from the beginning to the end, and the oracle in verses 5 to 11 is not an answer by God to the complaint in the moment of prayer. It is a quote or a flashback of an earlier revelation that Habakkuk has received. So earlier Habakkuk has received the revelation that God is rousing the Babylonians, and now their march is a historical reality, and Habakkuk has seen with his own eyes the violence and injustice that these people bring, and so he is complaining to God about the fact that the Babylonians have been raised by him. And in that reading, the whole of the chapter is about the Babylonians. The wicked in the beginning and in the end are the Babylonians. We then come to the famous passage in the beginning of chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, where Habakkuk, after he has prayed to God and lamented and complained about injustice and violence, decides to go possibly to the temple and watch and wait until he receives an answer, a satisfactory answer from God about his concerns. And then in verse 2 we are told that he actually receives an answer in the form of a vision, and the vision is about the end. That doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world, although it might. It means about a future decisive time when something will happen. And the main exhortation of the divine revelation is that the vision will come to pass, and it may be delayed, it may not come quickly, but one surely must wait for it. And then in verse 4 we have a description possibly of the two different ways in which one can respond to that vision and that revelation. There is a contrast here which echoes a little bit the contrast between the righteous and the wicked in chapter 1, but here the contrast is between the proud and the righteous. And the proud is one whose spirit is not right in them. They are presumably reject or refuse the revelation given in the vision. The righteous is the one who lives by their faith or faithfulness. This very famous verse, which is quoted 3 times in the New Testament, is a little tricky because some of the words can, although they're very common and familiar to us, they can be understood in different ways. First of all, the fact that the righteous shall live could be interpreted as remain alive, i.e. survive. So the righteous by faith will survive death or escape death. Or it can mean lead a certain lifestyle, so the righteous shall live in a certain way. And likewise, the word translated as faith has dual meaning. It can mean faith or it can mean faithfulness. In other words, the verse may be saying that the righteous person's lifestyle is characterized by an attitude of faithfulness, or it may mean that the righteous shall survive the coming disaster because of their faith in God's power, God's faithfulness. And both of these meanings are apparent in the New Testament. So in the famous passage in Romans, where Paul quotes Habakkuk and says that God's righteousness is revealed through faith because the one who is righteous will live by faith, has one nuance or relies on one nuance of the verse. But equally in the book of Hebrews, you have the same verse quoted by the author in the context of exhortation and encouragement for Christians who are undergoing persecution and struggle. And he is trying to encourage them not to give in, not to abandon their faith, to endure, because the righteous will live by faith, by faithfulness. Their lives will be characterized by a certain faithfulness, which means that they will not shrink back, but they will persevere. And then the rest of the chapter of chapter 2 consists of 5 woe oracles, or alas sayings. Different versions translate this Hebrew word as woe or alas. It is an exclamation which usually appears in prophetic literature and describes the fate or the dire consequences for someone who has done something bad. And there are 5 of those oracles, and again it is not entirely clear how they are related to the preceding. One possible explanation is that this is actually the content of the vision which Habakkuk has received. So if that is the case, the oracles are in some sense the climax of this part of the text. And what I'd like to invite you to do now is pause this lecture and look carefully at each of those 5 passages. And each of them revolve around the idea that what goes around comes around. So the idea of retribution is central to all these woe oracles. They do not portray retribution as something that God directly necessarily does, but it is something which appears to be part of the moral fabric of the universe. It is a world created by God in such a way that the deeds of the wicked come back on their head. And what I would like you to do when you pause this video and look at the text is observe in each of those and make a list in each of those woe oracles. What are specific actions of the wicked, and what is then their corresponding fate?
Okay, so is that clear? So I think I've got the slideshow here somewhere. Let me just find that again. There it is. There it is. Yeah. So to recap then, if we go back through the slides. Okay. So does that all, you want to comment on that, about anything to do with that?
One of the things that I was thinking of was when we did the previous book of Joel, there was that sort of time question, wasn't there, and the applicability. So he was talking about, depending on how you date it or read it, depends on who the wicked are and who are doing the violence. That business about being specific to a time or to a general time that is now or in the future.
Yeah.
So what struck me was the language, which, as he pointed out, is if you read the Psalms or Lamentations, you hear that. But the question mark for me throughout is the times. Is this the present? Is this the future? Because it wasn't immediately obvious that the voice changes.
No.
And I thought chapter 2 would be in the future. So it's
Okay.
it's that's what got me is what time are we talking? What time shifts might we be doing?
Yeah. So there's the question of time, which is definitely something that people talk about in context of scripture. What else would you observe? Before we sort of actually try and do that in any kind of detail.
I guess the other thing is it's a kind of quite big question, isn't it? It's a widely applicable question of God, why do you let violence happen? Why do you let wrong happen? It's a theodicy question, isn't it?
Yeah.
In some,
So how would, if you look at it in those terms, then what kind of what are you kind of looking for, or what kind of genre does this put it in?
well, I guess I'm thinking about it in terms of almost like lament and apologetics, questioning God as well.
When you say apologetics,
It's a question that many people will ask who say, who don't have a faith. So it's a core question that people ask. And it strikes me it's good to have an answer. I'm not saying particularly Habakkuk's rant about Babylonians will do it, but it's kind of it's a core question that people.
it's certainly one of those questions about existence, and it's certainly a very profoundly theological question about the nature of existence. And theodicy, I'd argue, is completely bound up with the worldview of Christianity and the scripture. Therefore, it's a question that you can't really avoid. And I would suggest, therefore, that one of the poverties of the prosperity gospel is its inadequacy at dealing with theodicy. It simply doesn't face reality in that respect. Because whilst there's a kind of seed of truth about the prosperity gospel, and that God does bless the righteous, and there is, reward to the righteous and all that kind of thing, it completely fails to address the question of suffering in the present. And its appeal, obviously, is that people want to escape from suffering. And you notice that where the prosperity gospel is often actually popular is places where people do suffer. So in other words, they're not asking the existential question, why do we suffer? They're trying to find a way out. So you might argue that the existential question of why do people suffer is a kind of leisurely question you can only really afford to ask when you're not actually suffering that much. Anyway, but no, you're right. I mean, this is definitely an issue of theodicy. And usually theodicy is part of a sort of component of wisdom type literature. So you see theodicy in Ecclesiastes, for example, and in Job, which are normally reckoned as wisdom literature. But often it comes up in the Psalms. This, as he says, the cry for help thing is a really common Psalm refrain. And that whole poetic genre of lament is part of the Psalms, which makes an interesting question whether lamentation or lament is part of wisdom literature. Should it be incorporated as a part of the genre of wisdom? But then if you actually look at the book of Lamentations, the actual thing called Lamentations, which is usually put after Jeremiah, that is a very elaborately structured poem. It's an acrostic, and it's the whole book is an acrostic book. It's 5 chapters. The 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 are quite short, and the middle chapter is quite long. It's double the length of the others, and that acrostic structure is repeated throughout the whole thing. So it's a very elegantly structured poem, Lamentations. You might argue it's superbly, beautifully structured. It's like Psalm 119, which is also an acrostic, which is also very beautifully written. And I would argue that Psalm 119 and Lamentations are both really beautifully written Hebrew. They are top notch. Whoever wrote them really knew how to write. They were really, really good writers. And I personally think of Psalm 119 as part of wisdom literature. It's a wisdom psalm. It contains covenant motifs, but a lot of it is about the principle of wisdom and in the context of the law and the words of God and that kind of thing. But obviously the law and the words of God are also part of the covenant. So, these two are intimately twined together in Psalm 119. And so if you're looking at it from the point of view of the acrostic, and therefore the lament as an acrostic, that would therefore lean towards a wisdom sort of genre. But it's also about theodicy. Why does it happen? You know, the Lamentations begins with that cry. It goes, "Achar," you know, how, why, Lord, you know, and that's a kind of onomatopoeia. It's a kind of cry of pain at the beginning, and then the whole poem goes on describing the kind of desolation of the whole thing. And interestingly, one of the few chronological markers for this is the idea of the rise of the Chaldeans, which is the lifetime of Jeremiah. And therefore, there is one verse in this which is seen as closely paralleled in Jeremiah, which possibly dates it, therefore, to the time just before the downfall of Jerusalem. Therefore, alongside that Habakkuk may have been a prophet alongside Jeremiah, which maybe explains the similarities at times. You know, that they're inhabiting the same world, they've got the same literary kind of culture going on around them, and that and Jeremiah, of course, it's thought wrote Lamentations. It's you know, it's traditionally he's attributed with the authorship of Kings 1 and 2, and with the Book of Lamentations, and as well as the prophet, you know, the book Jeremiah, and you can see the links between the three of them. You know, it's not a kind of careless association. There's definite links between the three bits of writing. So yeah. Oof, gosh, what a lot that was. So what else? Neil, you there?
Yes.
He lives. The man lives.
I am here listening.
So what did you think, Neil?
What's that?
Did you think anything?
Not really. I can see it's got similar patterns to Introduction as Joel, but
Yeah.
um,
As an examination of theodicy, then what's typically thought of as the kind of issues of theodicy? You know, generally in the most broad way.
Why if God is good and God is great and God can do anything, and God is love, is there suffering in the world for people who
So what
not
kind of suffering is included in the idea of suffering there?
I always took it to be every type.
Yeah, would you like to expand on that?
So suffering as a principle or as a concept. So in contrast to, say, Eden, where all our needs were met and life was untroubled to any extent, post-fall, how the world is broken, bad things happen to good people, multiple bad things can happen to good people, and it appears as if people who do bad things don't get punished and get away with it and prosper. So the question is it because God doesn't care, God can't, won't, and understanding that problem?
Would you include hunger and disease and that kind of thing in that?
It's difficult because I think that's where I was thinking about post-fall, because you've got the two types of evil, haven't you? So you've got a natural evil, which is the result, you know, your thunderstorm, your tsunamis rather, or your natural events, the aging of our bodies and things like that, and disease and illness, versus the deliberate, conscious choices of human beings to do bad things. And I guess you've got the two.
To take those three things separately, on one hand, you've got the aging of the body, and with that, you might add together our physical frailties of all kinds, you know, from toothache to leprosy to, you know, rheumatoid arthritis to waking up in the morning with a stiff neck and everything in between, you know, everything from mortal disease through to the daily discomforts of a body which is basically falling apart and going to self-destruct in due course. And then you've got, you referred to tsunamis. One very interesting story I heard about a place in Indonesia called Banda Aceh was that Indonesia is nominally Islamic, although it's not quite such a kind of dogmatic and tyrannous regime as some Islamic countries. And in this town called Banda Aceh, I think it was called, there was a Christian minority, fairly substantial, and they wanted to celebrate Christmas. And the Muslim authorities in town told them to bugger off and not celebrate Christmas in the town. So the Christian population all decamped from the town where they actually lived, and they all went up on this hillside to celebrate Christmas. Well, the tsunami came, totally wiped out the town, which is not far from the coast, but all the Christians were on the hill at the time. So it obliterated basically the town itself, the physical town. It killed loads of the Muslim people, but almost all the Christians survived. And it really shook some Muslims there, because from the Islamic point of view, they're the goodies and Christians are the baddies. And if so, that was a real question of theodicy. Why is it the baddies, the Christians, got off scot-free and the Muslims all got twatted by this natural disaster? But was the disaster evil? Because, of course, the Christians were all sitting on a hillside at the time, so they were fine. It was inconvenient in that they then had to rebuild their homes, but, you know, that happens for all kinds of reasons. But take a volcano. You know, if you don't actually live on a volcano, you're unlikely to be affected by it. If you do happen to live on a volcano, well, you've got to face facts. You're living on a volcano and it might erupt at some point. But if it comes to, you know, the grand scheme of things, one of the very interesting things about the planet is that we actually require carbon dioxide to live. As you're probably aware, plants need carbon dioxide to, you know, to work, and all life on Earth basically is based on plants. So in other words, if the plants run out of carbon dioxide, all our ecosystems will basically grind to a halt. They'll stop because the plants will all die. But carbon dioxide has a habit of becoming inert. If you simply leave it in the context of geology, it will eventually form carbonates and other inert compounds, which will simply stay. And so there is a strong tendency for carbon dioxide to become carbonates in geology. And the only way that actually carbon dioxide is therefore recycled out of the geology as it slowly accretes in there, and the accretion is a natural process which inevitably happens, is by volcanoes, because through plate tectonics, the Earth's crust is subducted, the carbonates and various carbon compounds become heated up, and then volcanoes belch out vast quantities of carbon dioxide. And therefore, plate tectonics and volcanoes are actually strictly necessary for life on Earth. Without them, there would be no life on Earth. So it begs the question, how evil is a volcano? You know, if it's actually necessary for life on Earth, that would suggest it's actually a good thing. Probably not a good idea to live on it, especially when it's in the mood for eruption. But the actual existence of a volcano would suggest, therefore, it's actually basically good. You know, and I've heard that actually recently our carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have been very, very low, to the extent where some plants are struggling to survive. And now there's been this slight increment in the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. It's actually helping plants grow quite a bit. And carbon dioxide levels in the past have been far higher than they are now, massively, exponentially higher. So you could argue that we're actually going through a real low slump in carbon dioxide, and therefore plants are probably at some of their lowest ebbs. So, you know, what you're seeing now is a slight greening of the deserts as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases, and therefore plants become more viable, because the reason they open the stomatophores in the leaves is so that they can actually suck in carbon dioxide. The more carbon dioxide is in the air, the less time they need to suck it in to actually make whatever they need to make. But all the time their pores are open, they're actually losing moisture. So the longer they can keep their pores shut, the less moisture they actually need. So that's why, with a slight increment of carbon dioxide, that the deserts are gradually greening currently. Which returns to the question, you know, where does the carbon dioxide come from? You know, some people would say it's coming from human activity, but volcanoes create huge amounts of it. And no one actually knows how many volcanoes there are on Earth, because you've got to include in this all the undersea volcanoes. So when you look at the great ridges in the middle of the oceans, all of them are belching out vast quantities of carbon dioxide on a continual basis through all those black smokers and undersea volcanoes, as well as the volcanoes we know about, say in Antarctica, but we hardly ever actually see. So they are actually maintaining life on Earth. So earthquakes, for example, are also part of that process. So obviously, if you're actually in a tower block that's badly built, an earthquake's very inconvenient. You might die. But if you're in open countryside, it's not actually a big problem. It's not a big deal. You know, it'll shake and you'll think, God, that was weird. Then you'll just carry on with whatever you're doing before. So, but what kind of suffering is explicitly described here?
Human against human, really.
Yeah.
Corruption and
What does that imply about the environment?
that it's not seen in the same terms.
When I talk about the environment, I mean in the broad sense of the place and the culture and the way in which all of these people are living. Put the question another way. When you're talking about the quality of wicked or righteous, what kind of qualities are they?
I would think that they're personal qualities.
But I mean, arguably, part of my personal quality is to have this hair. Is that wicked or righteous?
Spiritual, then.
Exactly. So this is talking about the spiritual context to their environment.
Yeah, I was thinking of moral, a bit like you were saying, with sort of part of the spirituality or part of their personality is the way their moral or value base, kind of an ethical.
So yeah, I mean that would be evidenced in the way they're talking or thinking. But fundamentally, I think Rachel's right. I think wickedness and righteousness are fundamentally spiritual qualities. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. Therefore, when it's crying out about these things, it's talking basically about the spiritual aspect of life.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could line up this, for example, it often talks about in the Old Testament idolatry and the wicked actions of idolaters. You know, those who kiss the images of bulls offer human sacrifice, that kind of thing. As well as the the general kind of violence and hedonism and debauchery and greed and dishonesty are often associated with idolatry as well.
So again, quick question. With regard to wicked and righteous, obviously it's playing on and relying on the previous past two lines of law and justice, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely contrasting them, yeah.
So it's not parallel. It's using the poetic license there in relating those two lines together, two ideas.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So this is the lament. And then you've got the what section would this be then?
Well, it depends how you look at it, doesn't it? So this potentially is a response.
Yeah.
The God's sort of response, if we're thinking about the dialogue, or this is the part where perhaps Habakkuk's going off into a kind of flashback from a previous oracle he's received, or from the things from Jeremiah.
Yeah, so, but the word you used is oracle. So who's the speaker then?
Well, presumably God, either as reported by Habakkuk or actually himself.
Yeah, exactly. So in other words, it's presented as what you call an oracle. In other words, a word from God, either directly to or being described by Habakkuk. Yeah. What does that kind of imply about it? If this is an oracle?
Pretty important. One would do well to take note of it, I would think.
Something like that. Yeah, I mean, if it's presented as a divine word, then yeah, you'd probably feel obliged to pay attention to it. And of course, it's this thing, I'm rousing the Chaldeans, is the one dating, detail in the whole of the book.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of allocates the time to the rise of the Chaldeans, the Kasdim, the Babylonians. So who were the power before the Babylonians? Can you remember?
The Assyrians, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's the Assyrians. So when you go through, where's it go? You remember the story of Hezekiah with Isaiah? It's the Assyrians that were besieging Jerusalem then.
Mm.
So that, if you like, is the high point of Assyrian power, with the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem under Hezekiah. And it's interesting that siege of Jerusalem is actually reported in the Assyrian archives. And Sennacherib, the commander there, appears in the history. And it is really interesting because it's one event in history which has got these multiple points of view. It's described in different perspectives in the Bible and in Assyria's own record. So it's really interesting to be able to see them side by side there. So up till then, and then you see the Babylonians supersede them as the great regional power. And that fierce and impetuous nation, that I remember in another translation, it said the fierce and hasty nation. Anyway, anything else you want to say about that?
The line struck me. You wouldn't believe it if you were told. And I was thinking, you are telling it. So it's something about it happening.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So, be astonished, be astounded. It's not like, in the future, I shall do this. Because if you say that, that you are, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
Um,
So, bearing that in mind, what phase of the rise of the Babylonians would this be then?
Well, he sort of says, "I am rousing," which is so maybe at the start of their campaign.
It does look as if it's the beginning of the rise of Babylon. Yeah. In other words, it says you'd not believe it if you're told. In other words, it's implying that unless I actually told you that the Babylonians are going to be the next big thing, you wouldn't have thought that. You'd be looking at Egypt and Assyria thinking they're the big powers. But I'm telling you it's going to be Babylon. And they're looking at, what? Babylon? It's a bit of a backwater, bit of a nobody place at the moment. But these are going to be the ones. There we are. And so to move on. What do you think about this?
I guess it's more lamenting the Odyssey again. So more because God, you're too pure to look on evil, and you know we know you're just, so you can't look on it. So how can you look on the treacherous and not do anything about the wicked? And some kind of implication that's in God's creation. You have made people like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler.
Yeah. Is he talking about the initial creation, or is he talking about the present state of them?
I tend to think it's more like the present state.
Yeah, I think you're right there. Because of course what's the another analogies of fish in the sea? Now, how's the idea of the sea used and the fishing used elsewhere in Scripture?
I only think about Jonah when we think about fishes in the sea.
But in that story of Jonah, what is the sea symbolic of? What does the sea represent?
Being lost and adrift from God, I think. Jonah gets on the ship and tries to run away.
Yeah.
I always saw it as being lost.
Well, normally in Scripture, the sea is symbolic of judgment. So Jonah being thrown in the sea is like Jonah being thrown into judgment. So that's not nice for the Hebrew mind. You get the Egyptian army being drowned in the sea at the Exodus. You get the flood of Noah. So you get the analogy of the sea being used a lot as the idea of the thing which is chaotic and destructive. So if you're talking about fish, they're somehow inhabiting the land of chaos and destruction. And of course, in the New Testament, people the apostles are compared to fishers of men. So it's as if symbolically they're pulling people out from chaos and destruction and landing them into life. Which, feel free, could it line up like that? You have made people like the fish of the sea. Is that what it's saying? Is that saying they seem lost? They seem full of chaos and destruction. They're inhabiting this world of chaos, like crawling things that have no ruler. What are the crawling things in Scripture?
Serpents, snakes. Sorry, Rachel.
Yeah, snakes. Yeah. So how would they be categorized according to the Israelite law?
Well, evil things, but
not evil per se. What about when Peter is told to kill and eat? What does he say then?
Unclean.
Yeah, unclean. So they're unclean. I'm just looking up the word there. A creeping thing, a moving creature. Yeah, so that's the word used in Genesis when it talks about the creeping things and the beasts. It comes from a stem ramas, a reptile or any other rapidly moving animal that creepeth, creeping. I once looked at thinking about translating Genesis, and I thought of using the word critter instead of creeping thing. The critters which crit. Because critters covers basically any little thing, doesn't it? Like mice, scorpions, spiders, snakes, insects, bugs, fleas. I mean, they're all critters, aren't they? So you could use that as a pretty inclusive term, meaning pretty well anything. The critters which crit. But do you think it's a complimentary way of speaking about people?
Well, the thing that sort of makes me think of is as Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, and they're talking about I think biting the heels and things that they're going to basically make life more difficult. They're going to make life harder for you. And so that kind of fits in, I think, doesn't it? You know, people are the unrighteous people are sort of bringing chaos and destruction, as you've just clarified for us in the interpretation of the sea, and they're also going to, and within that makes the life of the righteous that bit more, you know, difficult and arduous, and that would seem to me to be a kind of comparison, really.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison, actually. Yeah. So when it says he brings them all up with a hook, he drags them out with his net. Is that like the apostles? So who do you think are the them for judgment? That's one of the points that Charlie was trying to figure out, wasn't it? Who are the them?
Well, I think in the reading, it seemed to really depend on at what point in historically you were seating this, because it could be the Judean aristocracy, it could be the Babylonians, it could be what was the other option? I think it could be anybody that hasn't actually just accepted God, depending.
Yeah. Do you think it's necessary to be specific?
Well, I think it depends if you're doing a historico-critical response.
Well, you say that. I mean, if there are no indicators, is the message changed by non-specificity? Excuse me, being non-specific. Does the message require a firm identity for them or not? And it's a historical critical question to ask. Does the message require a firm identity?
Is that the bit about tying it to what the author meant? You know, when you're considering historical critical, you're looking at what the author meant to say.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if I'm wrong, but I tend to think, like Rachel was saying, it could be the Judeans, it could be the Syrians. I prefer to read it. I think it probably doesn't. I'm not as myself. Maybe that's like you said, maybe a reader critical thing. I'm less interested in the specific there, because I think that this could apply at any time.
It certainly could do, but if you wanted to answer it in that historical critical way, the question is, does it require a firm identity for them, or is the author speaking in more archetypical terms? Is he talking about an archetype of them or a generic them?
He doesn't say. I might have thought if he wanted us to know. So I know he mentions the Chaldeans, so it gives us a clue, and we could say that's the Chaldeans. But in using them, I mean, he could have been more specific if he say, and that, leader of the Babylonians, he's awful, he is. And he
Yeah,
hasn't.
absolutely, yeah.
So
that would suggest then that the author has made a choice not to be specific at that point.
Did Charlie say that in the reading somewhere? I
can't
feel
remember.
like he might have.
Well, could you argue because he doesn't mention anybody in specific, he makes the assumption that the reader knows who he's talking about?
It could be. It could be. I mean, the begins, I cry to you violence and you will not save. Now, when he's talking about violence, is he talking about the invading army, or is he talking about just horrible people in his district? He talks about the law becomes slack, justice never prevails. That would suggest a society problem, that the law is not being enforced, it's not being observed, not being upheld, and that which is right and fair, justice, the proper judgment, the proper allocation of rights and privileges and duties and obligations is not being done. And so, Habakkuk's complaint is the society is not working properly. It's not right. The wicked surround the righteous, suggesting that the wicked are more plentiful in number than the righteous. And that's the point of view, of course, of Psalm 1. Happy the man that walks not in the way of the scornful. And that in Psalm 1, that man is alone. And he's surrounded by the seats of the mockers and the paths of the wicked and all that kind of thing. But the poor old, the righteous man is alone. And that's why I hate the inclusive translations, because often they pluralize it. And then you lose that contrast between the solitary righteous one and the proliferation of the wicked around them. And that often is the experience. If you're going to be set on doing what is right, you often do feel really isolated. And so that Psalm 1, directly addresses that situation of feeling isolated in seeking to do what's right and avoiding the seat of the scornful and the places of the mockers. And here, the wicked surround the righteous. That would suggest then it's a similar circumstance they're talking about, that even if it's not absolutely alone, they're in a minority. And therefore you may well feel depressed, you might get despondent about it. You might feel hemmed in. So, there he could be talking about this, could be the same thing, that the social breakdown is begetting violence. But then he's talking about the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous nation, which are also not that nice. He marched through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. Dread and fearsome are they. Their justice and dignity proceed from themselves. So it's a bit backhanded, isn't it? Bearing in mind it's a prophet of God speaking. Their justice and dignity don't come from God, it comes from themselves. So that's just a description of their arrogance, their pride. Oof.
I think, as you said, Vicky, I think that Charlie does sort of allude to it, the broadness of the terms, the wicked and the righteousness allows for the later in sort of the wider interpretation by the later reader. But again, as it seems to be the case with the prophets, there's quite a bit sort of taken from the the reduction of things, and you know, discussion on what's been added a bit later and why it's been added, and which is makes a whole different kind of conversation, doesn't it? I think.
Should we have a quick look at the rest of the video?
Well, were we thinking that we were going to do what he asked or not, especially?
What did we ask? What did he ask us to do?
Well, he wanted us to look specifically at the 5 woe, alas sayings: 2, 6 to 8, 9 to 11, 12 to 14, 15 to 17, and 18 to 19, and say quite specifically what were the actions of the wicked and what were the fate of the wicked, because he was saying that what goes around comes around, it seems.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, we can do that. Yeah. Let me find the PDF. So we haven't actually looked at this yet, have we? Chapter 2.
No, we haven't got quite there yet, have we? We've had some amazing.
Okay, so we've got the 5 woe alas sayings, 6 to 9, 2, 6 to 19. So
He
I
doesn't.
haven't actually got them there. Shall I put those on screen then?
Who else is he?
What I'll do is I'll bring up the window. Okay, let's make it text a bit bigger. Can you all read that? Is that big enough to see?
Maybe we could put it on each of the small passages, perhaps make it.
That's the biggest the writing goes, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay. Well, I've got a Bible here anyway, so
Okay.
I think I need to get my.
Well, it says, "Woe to him who heaps up what is not his own, for how long, and loads himself with pledges. Woe to him who gets evil for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from reach of harm. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Woe to him who makes his neighbours drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. So if we look at the first woe then, woe to the Chaldeans. So what do you think about that then? The first woe, 6 to 8.
It says about taking goods in pledge in my translation, which suggests to me it's living on tick, sort of trying to be, living beyond
it. Way around. If he loads himself with pledges, it means that he's lending out, or he's loaning people and taking the pledge in return. So it's like gathering up sureties. So it's like a pawnbroker. Where is he who gathers up all this stuff and sits on it and has got no intention of giving it back again? Or it's like a loan shark, like loaning at exorbitant rates.
provident.
Yeah, the debt trap kind of thing.
Yeah, will not your own creditors suddenly rise?
Yeah.
So yeah, with menaces, I guess, those who you make tremble. So I can imagine them, here, pay up, or I'll nick your donkey or something.
So in a phrase, what's happening there?
Only bounties.
Sorry?
I think it's like Rachel was saying, it's what comes around, what goes around comes around. You get tarred with the brush you've dealt.
Yeah, I mean, you've been dealing out that, now it's going to come back on you. Yeah, absolutely. But then what does it say after that? Verse 8.
Collective punishment by who's left. It's
Well, it says,
very
you have
bleak.
plundered many nations. All the
Yeah.
remnant of the peoples shall plunder you. So it's saying, woe to him who heaps up what is not his own. And then it says, and loads himself with pledges. So then you've got this debt thing. You've taken the debts, you have burdened people with debt, you've trapped them in debt, you've taken their pledges. Now you are going to be in the same position. The tables are going to be reversed. Now you are going to be in hock to someone. Now you are going to be trembling because you owe something. But then it makes the analogy here, you have plundered, therefore you shall be plundered. It's almost as if the debting bit is actually something to do with the plundering. It's almost as if by plundering these nations, Babylon was running up this debt, which is now going to bounce back on them.
I might have read I think possibly I read this wrong, because I also saw like it on two levels, and I think, I don't know if Charlie mentioned this, but like, so one bit of it is the social evil of that anybody could do, and then the other bit, if you're a conquering horrible nation, that would be
Yeah.
so it's on
But,
two levels.
but are those two mutually exclusive?
No.
Because that could be talking about Babylon as this debtor, creditor, as well as the plunderer, and it could be talking about people as debtors, creditors, but also therefore as plunderers. They're not, to my mind, that's not mutually exclusive. It could go both ways at the same time. Sorry, I need to go to the loo, so feel free to go on to the next one.
Gosh, and this is only 2 chapters of Habakkuk, isn't it? You could go.
Yeah, absolutely.
What was the other one? What was the second one?
9 to 11. Woe to him who builds his realm by unjust gain, to set his nest on high, to escape the clutches of ruins. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. In my translation, and imagine yours is a bit different.
Alas for you who get evil gain for your houses, setting your nests on high. I wonder if that's like dodgy renting out of, like literally being a crooked landlord. You have devised shame for your house. Alas for you who build a town by bloodshed. Or maybe also like you've sacked the town and you've nicked all the houses. That kind of idea.
You can see the student housing crisis at the moment, where ceilings are collapsing and all that, can you? That's what you're talking about there, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Gosh. But it's seemingly saying a bit like in Macbeth, when Lady Macbeth can't get the murder out of her head and she's hearing it all the time. It's similarly seeming to say that, wherever you go, the actual fabric of what you've done will just cry out, and you're not going to be able to escape.
Gosh, it's a harrowing thought, isn't it? I mean, It's quite raw. I mean, again, read a possible reaction, but it is quite stern stuff, isn't it? I'm going to remember that. Thank you, Rachel. Lady Macbeth and that stain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is all about your sort of motivations and your manners, the way that you're operating. If are you operating in a righteous way?
So what about the next one? Then woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labour merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God, as the waters cover the sea.
Is that another contrast? The city of sin built on bloodshed versus the kingdom of God built on God's glory. It's another parallel, perhaps, or
Well, there's definitely a contrast. I mean, woe who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity is obviously condemnation on that. But then when it says, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God as the waters covers the sea, that sounds eschatological, doesn't it? And it's got the allusion to waters again, the idea of Noah's flood, obliterating the evil. And then
how do you read has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that nations exhaust themselves for nothing? Is that really that, without unless one is sort of guided and motivated by the Lord and doing the Lord's work, that really, it all comes to nothing anyway. You might think that you might think that you've done great work, or it might feel at the time like you're right up there, you're the main people, but actually when it comes to it, the likelihood is that it will become nothing if that's not what the Lord is about.
Can you think of any verses which mirror those thoughts exactly?
About yes.
Because if you can, you're probably onto a good thing. You're probably thinking along the right lines. You're probably reading this well. If you can think of immediately, got other verses which come to mind which mirror those thoughts.
Yes.
There's one of the Psalms that says, unless the how does it go? Those who labor in vain. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain.
Yeah.
Unless the Lord watches a city, the watchmen wait in vain. In vain you rise early and work late, for the Lord gives his beloved sleep in their beds. And then there's in the New Testament, it talks about the Lord subjecting them to futility. That life becomes meaningless when estranged from God, that it really is futile. It actually goes nowhere.
What I'm thinking of as well is because I was thinking of the house built on sand when you were talking, but then I suddenly thought of the Beatitudes.
Absolutely, yeah. I was wondering when you picked that up.
Like these are the woes. I mean, Jesus does the woes as well, doesn't he?
Woe
to you, woe to you. But then you have the blessings, and then it's like almost like a reversal.
Yeah, no, you're right. I'm sure that's a very wise analogy to make, and I'm sure you'd do well to look at these things in the light of the Beatitudes. Yeah. What about this next one? Woe to him who makes his neighbours drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. What is that a straightforward allusion to? There's a very obvious story there, which is, which that seems to reflect.
David and Bathsheba.
No, there was no drinking going on there. That was just
Just pure.
So Abraham.
no, close.
There's somebody in the very early Old Testament who they get him drunk on purpose.
No, you're mixing together two stories there.
Oh, because somebody then ends up with a tent peg in their head, but I can't remember.
Oh, that's the third one. That's another one again. Jael knocks a tent peg through the guy's head after he runs away from being defeated in battle, because that's when Deborah told Barak to lead the army out to go and meet the Midianites. And Barak said, "I'm scared unless you come with me." And he says, "If you make me go with you, if you don't go on your own, man up, boy. A woman will take your enemy." And he says, "I want you to come with." So in the end, the king escapes, runs in and takes refuge in the tent of Jael. And then while he's asleep, she drives a tent peg through his head. But no, the one about deliberately making them drunk was Lot and his daughters. After they ran from Sodom, there were no men around, and the two girls said to each other, "Look, there's no men around. Let's make our father drunk so he can make us pregnant, so he can have children." And they were the progenitors of Ammon and Moab. And but the story about getting drunk and then naked is actually the story of Noah. It's after the flood. It says he was a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard, and he got drunk and fell asleep with no clothes on. And Ham, his youngest son, came and saw him lying there naked and drunk, laughed at him, and went and told his brothers. And the two brothers, embarrassed at their father, took up a piece of cloth between them and then walked backwards to cover up their dad so that they wouldn't see him in his nakedness. So this is, that's the only story I can think of where someone is drunk and naked and everyone's laughing. So this, to my mind, seems to be, woe to him who makes his neighbours drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. It's like he's saying he's deliberately trying to humiliate them and expose their weakness. You'll have them drink your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. Well, that's an allusion to nakedness as well. But all these metaphors are mixed, aren't they? Because it says you pour out your wrath and make them drunk, having talked about ordinary drinking, and then the nakedness, which is about being drunk and stupid. And then it says drink and show your uncircumcision. In other words, getting drunk and lying there with no clothes on. And then it says the cup is the Lord's right hand will come to you. In other words, the cup of wrath, which is another allusion there. So these metaphors of getting drunk, getting embarrassed, being stupid, being misled, and then God's anger on evil are all kind of mixed up together. But where's all this going, this whole passage? Because this carries on 15 down to 90, 20. So, what's the whole trajectory of this particular woe?
It goes back to God.
Yeah.
But the Lord is in his holy temple. But the God was talking. So again, it's almost like a switch again, isn't it? Because it doesn't say, "For I, the Lord, are in my holy temple, let the earth keep silence." It says the Lord. So the vision or God's reply concludes with, "But don't worry, the Lord is in his temple."
I'm just wondering if the woes are said by God or by the prophet. Because it talks about verse 13, is it not from the Lord of hosts that people labour merely for fire? Because that seems to speak about God in the third person. For the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, again, verse 14, that's the third person. The cup in the Lord's right hand, verse 16, that's another third person. So it could be the Lord speaking in the first person, but all the references to him are all in the third there, in that passage.
Well, we seem to be coming on to that, possibly, as being that bit 5 to 20 in one possible reading being part of the vision sent by God to Habakkuk. I think Charlie's about to talk about that, it seems.
So if you take this whole section then from 15 to 20, what does it seem to be? What's its basic point? Its basic premise?
It's not going to work out well for you.
No, that's definitely so. But what aspect of life is it fundamentally about?
Ungodly, unrighteous ways.
There's definitely that. But it's about religion, isn't it?
Mm.
This whole section, 15 to 20, is about the true worship of God. Woe to him who makes his neighbours drink, you pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. It's talking about the fact they're idolaters. And that is what's perverting their judgment. That's why they're not doing the right thing. That's why there's violence and injustice and corruption and all these other evil things going on. You know, it says, the cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. Well, you know, the idea of glory was sometimes used in the Psalms and the prophets as the idea of their worship. You know, the Lord was the glory of Israel. He is their glory. So when they invoke it that the utter shame will come upon your glory, it's like saying, you have chosen these idols to be your glory, and you're going to be ashamed of them. You know, the stupidity of this is going to be laid bare and exposed, and then you'll see what you are. You know, it's like the fact they're worshipping these things is like they're drunk. It's like they're mad. You know, they're not in their right mind. And they're going to end up lying down dead drunk with no clothes on, like a drunkard, because they've been worshipping these idols. They're going to be found utterly helpless and useless and exposed. And you know, it talks about the blood of man, the violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them, because of all this stuff. That the idolatry leads to the blood of man and violence of the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. What's the significance in verse 19? It says, behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath in it at all.
Well, it's complete opposite to somebody who has an interaction and a living faith in the Lord, who is a living, breathing, moving, communicative God, as opposed to just a lump of stone or a lump of.
And what are the vital qualities of God?
Relationship.
Yeah, and more fundamental to that, and the Lord lives, doesn't he?
Yeah.
The Lord is alive. And this thing, this wooden thing, isn't alive. And the word breath, you probably missed possibly the innuendo there, but the word breath in Hebrew is ruach. That's the name of the Spirit of God, the breath of God. God has his Holy Spirit, his breath with which he creates and everything else. Let's scroll down. Verse 15. Just check that I've got the right word there.
Ruach.
Yeah, there you go. Ruach. And there is no breath, no ruach. Ruach ein. Breath there is not. B'karaivo. In its midst. There is no breath in its midst. So, can you all see what I've got on screen? I've got the Hebrew text there. Can you see that, or are you looking at the PDF?
Yeah, we can see the Hebrew.
Oh, right. There we go. Sometimes get confused about what's visible and what isn't. But there you go. So, yeah, so if you're reading this in Hebrew, the word ruach there would suddenly light up because you'd realize that that is also the Spirit of God. That's the breath of God. So this idol doesn't have the breath of God in it. In other words, God didn't make the idol. He didn't breathe it. He didn't speak it. And it has no breath to give. This idol cannot breathe its breath on you to give you life. And that is the complete contradiction between the presence of the living God, the glory of Israel, who breathes on them. And we had those fantastic readings from Ezekiel last week. Did you have them in your church? Ezekiel 37, the valley of dry bones. And all through that passage, they use that one word, breath, all the way through. When it talks about the four winds and the breath shall enter you and you shall live, it's all the same word in Hebrew. So it just keeps reiterating the breath, the breath, the breath, the breath. So, in the light of that, this would really kind of hit you between the eyes. This is not God. Where are we now?
Last bit of Charlie.
Yeah. Last bit of Charlie. Do you want to see the last bit of Charlie then? There's not much left, actually.
Which usually appears in prophetic literature and describes the fate or the dire consequences for someone who has done something bad. And there are 5 of those oracles, and again it is not entirely clear how they are related to the preceding. One possible explanation is that this is actually the content of the vision which Habakkuk has received. So if that is the case, the oracles are in some sense the climax of this part of the text. And what I would like to invite you to do now is pause this lecture and look carefully at each of those 5 passages. And each of them revolve around the idea that what goes around comes around. So the idea of retribution is central to all these war oracles. They do not portray retribution as something that God directly necessarily does, but it is something which appears to be part of the moral fabric of the universe. It is a world created by God in such a way that the deeds of the wicked come back on their head. And what I would like you to do when you pause this video and look at the text is observe in each of those and make a list in each of those war oracles. What are specific actions of the wicked, and what is then their corresponding fate? Okay, so here is just one possible reading of Habakkuk's chapter 1 and 2, chapters 1 and 2. There are different ways of reading it because, as I explained earlier, it is not entirely clear how the different sections are meant to relate together. So the different interpreters and different readers will connect them differently. But you could say that in the chapter 1, the prophet complains to God about violence and injustice, and God answers him by sending him a vision in the beginning of chapter 2, and encouraging him to trust in this vision, to believe in its message, and to live a life which is characterized by perseverance and endurance in the light of that revelation. And in the 5 oracles, maybe the content of that vision and its message is that the wicked will eventually be judged. Their deeds will come back to haunt them. The key question now that I would like you to consider is, who are the wicked historically? And you need to do this, first of all, by looking carefully at the text and trying to speculate and use your imagination, and also look at the reading material and consider how different approaches to the historical context of the book of Habakkuk perhaps give us different answers to the question, who are the wicked.
Right. So, after all that, who are the wicked? If you take the whole 2 chapters in their entirety. You're looking a bit baffled, Neil.
Well,
I think we touched on this a little bit earlier,
Yeah.
didn't we? It sort of did depend a little bit, as Charlie alluded to, as to how you read it.
So, from an academic point of view, what kind of answers is Charlie looking for to this question?
depending on how you date it, would depend on who the big bads are in terms of foreign nations. So he was talking about, we've got that in the reading about, is it the Babylonians, or are we talking about the Assyrians?
Well, he actually does say the Chaldeans, so that's
Yeah.
kind of fairly clear. But the question is, how should that be understood in the context of the rest? I mean, do you think Charlie's looking for a specific, clear, definitive answer, like a mathematical answer?
No.
So what is he looking for?
I think it's like Rachel said, it's like for a thought out rationale.
Yeah.
Effectively.
Absolutely.
Looking at it in the round.
Yeah.
Noting, so Charlie said, you've got Assyrians, Egyptians, or Babylonians, but you've also got Judeans, or you could be talking universally.
Absolutely.
Um,
And as we made the observation, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
all of the above.
So, you just need to demonstrate how you could read this, or how you could apply it, or how these various different groups could qualify in the light of this.
In our essay, we were asked to split this into 2, aren't we? It's historical critique and really orientated. How do you split the 2? How did you find this?
I'm not sure you have to make a rigid separation. I think you just have to be able to identify the difference between the 2, if you like, directions of examination. So if you're going to look at a passage, you could say, well, this is a more historical, critical approach. Well, this is a more reader-oriented approach. Or if you took an answer, you could say, as a reader, you'd want this answer, but historically, it'd be hard to justify in these terms. He just wants you to be aware of them. They're
Right.
not rigid categories. They're kind of directions of thought or examination rather than rigid declensions.
Okay.
But I think you're right, Neil. I think we are supposed to devote sort of a good portion of our essay to our
It says both. It says do historical
Yeah.
critique and then compare and contrast it to reader orientated approach.
absolutely.
So he's then saying demonstrate the knowledge of chosen text. So
Yeah.
whether you choose this one or Joel, whichever, so you got to show an understanding what it's trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Put in historical understanding, is I was saying. So how they would understand it of the day.
Well, he's asking for you to begin with that historical thing. So he's asking you to think, well, where does this fit historically? What kind of literary genre is this? What kind of language is the author using, or what kind of figures of speech is he using? Therefore,
Right.
what would it suggest that he's trying to say to us? What would appear to be the author's intention?
Yes.
And then from that, you then say, well, as a reader, this is how it might be received. But as as we've seen, neither of these texts, neither Joel nor Habakkuk, have a lot of historical precision in them.
Well, no, unless you look into particular styles of writing.
Yeah. But in the one from Joel, for example, it
Yeah.
talks about the temple, but no reference to a monarch, which would suggest it could be the Second Temple period, post-exilic. Yeah. With this one, Habakkuk, it's referring to the rise of the Chaldeans. Makes no reference to a ruler or to a temple for that matter, but it does talk about the Chaldeans, and it talks about the rise of them, which would suggest that in the one it says, who would have thought it? It could be a hyperbolic, bit of irony or sarcasm there, but it could mean that it's actually very early in the rise of the Babylonians. Or it could be reflecting on the rise of the Babylonians, thinking, gosh, when this started, who would have thought it's going to be the Babylonians of all people? But now look at them. Now they're the big bad. They're the ones that are flattening everyone in their path.
So you could say, with both texts not being able to narrow down and addressing a certain key people, then that leaves it open to interpretation as an oracle, a prophetic text, so it can be transcend time, doesn't it? So you can read it today as he read it when it was written, because it doesn't specify the group
well,
of
they've
people.
both got those eschatological allusions to them.
That's the word I was looking for.
So they both could be read as addressing historical context, or they could both be read as drawing from historical context, but actually primarily directing the reader's attention to an eschatological answer. Or it could be a kind of blend of the two, that it's addressing present concerns and giving an eschatological answer to the present concerns.
And that would be the reader-orientated approach, wouldn't it?
That could be addressing the author's intention, in which case that's historical critical. But then you might ask, well, how do you receive that now? What does this do for you? And that would definitely be the reader-oriented approach. Would you prefer to allocate this to a portion of history, or would you rather see this as your own eschatological anticipation?
And then how we can view that in our own life.
Yeah.
Okay. So I can't wait for a couple so we can ask questions about this essay, because I got loads.
Because I guess the bit in my head is that if it's a Venn diagram, I think there's a bit where it overlaps, because it gets muddy at the edges, and then there's obviously more ways of reading text. So I guess at some point you'll have to acknowledge that actually there's more. So you probably use more. I don't know, but
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. They do blur into each other, and it's not always easy to separate them. And there are clear things which you could say which are definitely one or definitely the other, but there is that huge overlap in the middle. And especially with these rather ambiguous texts like Joel and Habakkuk, where the historical thing is not clear. So you're very limited in that kind of application. So then you're talking about the author's intention and the author's motive and all that, which you can only really read from the words he's using. He doesn't give any explanation of it himself. So you're then falling back on a kind of reader-oriented response to the author's apparent intention, according to what you see in it, which basically is a reader-oriented approach, but you're actually developing it from a historical critical one, in that you're trying to perceive the author's intention, which is unclear.
And then with the redactional parts thrown in as well, where somebody else has used their own kind of reader-oriented
Yeah.
sort of interjections, the whole thing is just a bit.
Yeah, so I mean, if you get into the redaction aspect, the way that the book has been compiled, that obviously is a historical critical component to, to examining what's written. Does that make a difference? Do you respond to the book as a whole anyway, or does the process of editing suggest that some parts should be taken more seriously than others, or that some are authentically from God and others are actually human commentary on this, or something like that?
Could you say we are at a disadvantage because we've read the whole Bible, the New Testament, the Old Testament? So we've read the New Testament. So when you're reading through these texts, we can already compare to the New Testament scripture when we're reading it. So would that put us at a different? We'd view that text differently then already, wouldn't we? Because we can make links to the teachings of the Gospels, the teachings of Jesus in whatever text we're reading. So we're not reading it in its true form.
Well, Charlie invites that comparison in that he invites you to look at the letter to the Hebrews and the letter to the Romans as quotations of Habakkuk's "the righteous shall live by faith." So that's part of it. On the other hand, you can remember Jesus, when he's in one debate, he says, Abraham saw my day and was glad. And the Pharisees ask him, well, how do you know what Abraham thought? You're only not even 50 years old. And then Jesus retorts to that, before Abraham was, I am. That's a divine claim. But the interesting thing about that is that he's saying that Abraham somehow intuited Jesus. So therefore, Abraham, if you like, was no disadvantage in perceiving Jesus. Even though he didn't actually have the Bible with him, he still saw Jesus' day. So you might say, therefore, if that's true, obviously that's an insight from the New Testament, from the Gospel of John. Therefore, it is no contradiction or somehow no subversion of the text to read into it those things. That Jesus seems to assume that they're just there. That he is there in them. Abraham saw my day and was glad. What did Habakkuk see? He saw my day. What did Joel see? He saw my day.
Right. So so that would be again our read-orientated approach, as if we can.
Well, I mean,
the New Testament in it. We see Jesus in it because you wouldn't.
I mean, Joel and Habakkuk obviously inherit the prophetic tradition.
Yes.
Now, neither of them are attributed to be early in the prophetic tradition. Neither of them are allocated a portion with the judges, for example, or at the same time as Elijah and Elisha. So that means that they would have been self-consciously following in the footsteps of Moses, and they would have known the other writings, and they would be conscious of the other things which people said and did. And if we're to date Joel, for example, in the early Second Temple period, just post-exilic, and if we're to date Habakkuk as just before the exile, then the same period of time as Jeremiah, that means they're actually quite late in the prophetic tradition. That means, for example, conceivably, Habakkuk is conscious of the writings of Jeremiah. He knows of Jeremiah the prophet. He knows of the oracles of Jeremiah. That means they both know the oracles of Isaiah, for example. They're both familiar with Isaiah, the ministries of Isaiah, therefore the ministries of Micah, the ministries of, that have known the stories of Elisha and Elijah. So they'd see themselves as following in that tradition as part of that ministry. Especially since the book opens up, the oracle of Habakkuk. I think, how does it start off? Chapter 1 opens up. He skipped it in the thing. A burden, Chamasah Asher Chuzah Habakkuk Hanavi. The burden, which is it's an unusual word. The burden, the oracle, the vision, the seeing, the pronouncement, which Asher Chazah, which saw Habakkuk, the prophet Hanavi. So there he clearly identifies himself as Hanavi, the prophet. Habakkuk Hanavi. And the language there, Hamasah Chazah, the burden which he saw, is the kind of vocabulary used of that kind of thing. You can go through the various ways these things are described, and it's not quite clear how significant they are. When he says Hamasah, it's not clear if Hamasah is a distinct genre or if that should be, it's just a synonym for an oracle or a word or anything else. Joel opens up, doesn't he, with the word of the Lord that came to Joel. So are they saying the same thing? Interestingly, the Hamasah is the word that's used by, do you know the story of Jehu? No? Do you know the story of Ahab and Naboth's vineyard?
Feel like we will when you
say it. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, Ahab was the proverbial bad king of the Old Testament. He was the wicked king of Samaria, and he was married to the woman Jezebel, who was the daughter of the king of Tyre or Sidon. I can't remember which one. She was from up there. She was from one of the Phoenician cities. And he was, it says it was a small thing for him to do what his forebears had done. He did that and more. He was the bad king. And he eventually ended up killing, he wanted the vineyard of Naboth, which was near the city of Samaria. And Naboth wouldn't sell it to him. And he went around sulking for a while. And his wife says, "Come on, grow up, man up, boy. I'll show you what to do." So she goes out, she slanders Naboth, has him killed, stoned for false reasons. And then Ahab takes possession of the vineyard. And then the prophet Elijah sends a word to him saying, "Because you have done this, the dogs will lick your blood from this city, and your wife will be as refuse on the ground." That's the curse pronounced by Elijah on Ahab and Jezebel because of this thing. And later on, when Jehu avenges the evil of Ahab and Jezebel, he says, "I was young and I heard the burden pronounced by the prophet." And he uses the same language there. So in other words, when Jehu was a young man, he heard the prophet actually say that to Ahab. And when he reached his middle years, when he actually slaughtered the royal family and he killed Jezebel, he actually he drove up to the palace, and she appeared at the window saying, "Why are you here, you murderer of your master?" And he looks up at the people, the servants standing behind her, and says, "Who's with me?" And the servants throw her out of the window. And she goes splat on the ground, and the horses and the chariots drive over her body and break it up. And he goes into the city, takes possession of the palace, and then he goes out and again thinks, "Oh man, I should go and offer a burial to the woman because she was the daughter of a king." And when he goes out, it turns out the body's already been pulled apart, and the dogs have taken bits and pieces of it around, and they can only find bits and pieces of it, so they can't find a complete body to bury. So they say, so there's nowhere that can say this is Jezebel. So it's a horrible story, ghastly story, and that's what Jehu remembers. He says, "When I was young, I was there when Elijah pronounced this Masah, this burden." So it could be, Habakkuk is invoking that idea of the Masah, the burden, the condemnation, the judgment, when he uses this language. Or maybe not, because it's not quite clear. Because these are not precise terms. This is not a legal document. if you like it. There's an essay written by C.S. Lewis called "Is Theology Poetry?" And that title keeps coming to mind because so many of the things are hard to categorize. You know, you can't give them a rigid legal categorization or a mathematical definition. And if you think of it, and so much of the Bible is poetry. You know, we're reading Joel and Habakkuk are basically poetry, aren't they? How do you read poetry? You know, how are you meant to understand poetry? This is the historical critical question. It is poetry. How do you meant to read poetry? What is the kind of thinking that you're meant to use to interpret poetry?
Which is interesting because I would say spiritually.
Yeah.
Would be my immediate response. So that is interesting.
And of course, he's talking about good and evil, which are inherently spiritual qualities. I mean, this whole book of Habakkuk basically is a kind of meditation on the nature of good and evil, isn't it? It's partly about theodicy, as you said earlier. You know, why do the wicked prosper? Why do the innocent suffer? But it's also about how good and evil happen and what happens as a consequence. Because, of course, the latter part of it is about the retribution on the wicked. You know, it's not why do the wicked prosper? It's you wicked, you have prospered. Now it's going to get to you. How are you going to get your comeuppance?
Well, as ever, that was enormously stimulating, and I've enjoyed it. But I've been weary today, so I'm afraid I think I'm just going to say thank you and take myself away.
We've had 2 hours. That's not a bad stretch, is it?
No, thank you. No, it's been a good
Gone
session.
very quickly. It's been really enjoyable as ever. It feels really odd thinking that there's what two more definites and then a third which is going to be pretty close to the wire, but good for having thank you, love. Good for having sort of clarity on things, or wanting to discuss particular points.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Awesome.
thank you as ever, Jeremy, Vicky.
Thank you, Rachel.
And yeah, blessings on this next week.
Yes.
Vicky, I'm sorry, do you mind my asking, why does it say St. Asaph Pool on your window?
Diocese of St. Asaph, Pool Mission Area.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So I can't remember why, but early doors I was asked to put that on my Zoom so that people know which diocese and that I'm from. I think for some formation stuff. So yeah, that's why.
Okay. There we are. Well,
Awesome.
nice to see
Right.
you. Anyway.
Nice to see you, and see you next Thursday.
Yep, next Thursday. See you then. Yeah.
Take care. Bye for now.
God
Good
bless.
night.
God bless.
Good night, Neil.
Night, Neil.
See you soon,
Bye.
Neil.
Yeah, catch it.